Hey, you cool cats and kittens. It's Miss Yabut again. Wow, you all did such a great job identifying fact from fiction in yesterday's first couple chapters of our historical fiction text, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. Before we read chapter 3 today, I have a couple of announcements. First, remember that if you didn't already this morning, make sure that you go on Lexia for 30 minutes today. You need 150 minutes by Friday, and if you've already done your Lexia, you should already have 60 minutes. As a reminder, scholars, we also have office hours from 2:45 to 4 o'clock today, which is 3 Vista virtual points. Today, I got to hang out with some scholars and enjoy some pizza and play some games. I can't wait to see you also working to earn those points. ELA Masters, I am so excited to get to read Chapter 3 of our historical fiction text today, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. Remember that when reading any historical fiction text, good readers always ask ourselves, how is the setting important to the plot of the story? We now know that Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes takes place in Hiroshima, Japan, in 1954, which is 9 years after the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. We also want to ask ourselves, what can stories like Sadako's teach us as readers about the past and the values and beliefs that were happened during that time? Finally, I want to ask myself, how do I as a good reader distinguish fact from fiction when reading historical fiction? ELA Masters, you did such a great job with this yesterday. Before we move on to chapter 3, let's quickly review what historical fiction is. Remember that we can always go into resources and click on our historical fiction resource. Scholars, because you're becoming such experts by now, I want to give you 45 seconds to see if you can answer these first two questions. What kind of text is historical fiction? Is it narrative or info text? And which of the following are characteristics of historical fiction? Select all that apply. Get ready and go. About 10 more seconds, scholars. Great. Let's review. My turn. Historical fiction is an imaginative story that takes place in the historical past and may have some real events or people. Now you try. Historical fiction is an Great job, friends. We know that historical fiction, like Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, is an imaginative story. So, yes, Sadako Sasaki was a real girl, and she did really live in Japan in 1954, but many details, like Sadako's thoughts and feelings, come from the author's imagination. They are make believe, which means that historical fiction is narrative. It is not real. Show me a yes if you got that. Good. The first characteristic of historical fiction is that the setting is important. Can you remind me, what is the setting of Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes? Don't get tricked. Right. If you said Hiroshima, Japan, 9 years after the atomic bombs were dropped there, so in 1954, we remember that the bombs were dropped in 1945. Show me an oh yeah. Yes. The time and place are important in an historical fiction text. We just read from the first chapter yesterday that Sadako attended a ceremony commemorating this real event that happened in time. Our second historical fiction characteristic is that it is often focused on real issues of the time and characters' perspective of them. ELA Masters, do you remember what important day Sadako and her family were getting ready to attend? Tell me. Right. It was Peace Day. And they were there to remember the tragic event that happened when the atomic bomb destroyed their city. We know now that this was a real event that happened, and we're getting to see the effects of that event through Sadako and her family. Our third characteristic of historical fiction is that some values, perspectives, and living conditions are different from today. Sadako and her family consider what happened when the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima as terrible, as we now agree with today. Let's go ahead and double check our answers. If you selected that the setting is important, it is often focused on real issues of a time in history, and that these values, perspectives, and living conditions are different from what they are today, go ahead and kiss your brain. Nice work, friends. By now, we know that historical fiction is not nonfiction. This is not an informational text. But we do know that as good readers, we often read a nonfiction text before we read the fiction text because it builds our schema, right, about the setting and important people and events of the time. Yesterday, I asked you all, how did reading the nonfiction text last week, The Atomic Bomb, help us to better understand our fiction story, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes? One scholar said that the atomic bomb helped us understand more about how people died and the sickness from the atomic bomb's radiation in Japan. And now we know that in Japan, they remember this day with a day called Peace Day. We also know that the atomic bomb was dropped 9 years before the events of Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. So we're thinking about, what does this have to do with how people in Japan were living years after the bomb was dropped? Finally, as scholars, we remember that as good readers, we always ask ourselves whether a detail in the text is fact, it is a real thing from history, or fiction. Which parts of the story were coming from the author's imagination? You all did such a great job identifying fact and fiction in the story. We know that the facts from yesterday in chapters 1 and 2 included that the setting was in Japan in 1954, and this celebration that Sadako and her family are attending is in observance of Peace Day, which honors all of those who were killed when the bomb was dropped 9 years before. We also learned a new detail that the atom bomb disease that is caused by the radiation we read about last week in the atomic bomb is a disease called leukemia. And that the atomic bomb was so devastating that it burned some people very badly. But some parts that were fiction in our story that came from the author's imagination include Sadako's thoughts and feelings and her perspectives on what was going on. For example, how she was excited to go to the Peace Day Carnival, and she was so happy to find a spider, a good luck charm, and even how she was holding on tight to her best friend Shizuko's hand as they were walking through Peace Park. These are details that are make believe and are fiction. Let's review, friends. What genre of text are we reading today? Tell me, historical fiction or info text? Yes, we are reading historical fiction. This is make believe and comes from the author's imagination, even though there are some facts. Remember, as good readers, we have to ask ourselves, is the time, place, important people, or important events real things from history? If so, remind me, what are these called? Yes, these are facts. As good readers, we also have to ask ourselves which parts of the story are coming from the author's imagination, like any details that had to do with Sadako and her thoughts or feelings. These are, tell me, fiction. Right. ELA masters, make sure that you take a moment to double check all of your answers. Today, we'll be reading chapter 3. And just as a reminder, here are some predictions that we had from last week. Some scholars predicted that the setting of this story is in Japan and that Sadako will talk about what happened years after the atomic bomb attacks. This scholar also predicted that even Sadako might get sick from the atomic bomb, but survives. Scholars, as we are reading chapter 3 today, don't forget to make sure that we have our historical fiction journal with you. I know that I've been using my journal every day while reading Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes to help me process some of what Sadako might be thinking or feeling after these horrible atomic bombs were dropped. When you're finished double checking your answers, go ahead and click Next to continue.